We're doing a study of lessons we're calling generational strategies, and what we're doing is looking at the different facets of life, different stages of life, different seasons of life. In this particular lesson, I'm going to call this the growth cycles of a church, the growth cycles of a church. And what I'm going to deal with is different stages that a church goes through in its growth cycle. Now, just as in human life, DNA is the blueprint for our life. Our DNA, it gives all the information that we need to be able to define who we are. We inherit 23 chromosomes from our father, 23 from our mother. So when you mix those together, it makes us a unique individual. We are one of a kind. There's no one else exactly like you. Well, this is not only true individually, it is also true of churches. There are no two churches that are exactly the same. They cannot be. And obvious reason for that is each pastor has his unique gifts and talents. God has created them and given them whatever the gifts and talents they are. There's no one else like them. Then, of course, pastors are working with people. So every church is uniquely made up of the people that God has given them and their unique gifts. When you put that all together, it's the same as it is with the individual. We are one of a kind. Now, in this particular lesson, I'm going to deal with 5 different stages that a church goes through in its growth cycle. These 5 different stages. And in fact, let me step to the board here and show you what I'm talking about in a graph form. We begin, of course, with the birth stage with dream and vision. Then we go into growth. Growth is where we begin to set goals. It's where we begin to establish our values, those things which are important to us in life. And then the third stage is what I will call maturity. Maturity is a place where you start becoming very efficient in what you're doing. You've developed your gifts, your church structure has been developed. So that is the mature stage of a church. The fourth stage is what I'm calling maintenance, and that becomes the danger zone. Every church will reach this sooner or later. You reach the plateau where everything climaxes. If we're not careful, it is that stage that we turn to an attitude of apathy, a don't care type attitude. And then the fifth stage, of course, it's a stage of death. The stage of death, where doubt and division become predominant things within our life. So that gives you a graph form of what we're going to be discussing in this particular lesson. Let me take you to the first stage. The first stage of what I'm calling here the birth of a church. This is a brand new church that's either just been planted, that had just started because of someone's conversion experience and coming to know Jesus Christ as their Savior, and a leader rises up from among them and it begins a brand new church. This is a wonderful time in every church's life. It's a time of new love. It's a time of excitement. Everybody is excited because of the new church. Now, almost every case, when you're in a new church stage, you're dealing with very limited resources. Just like a young couple getting married, most of them do not start off where their parents are after 30, 40 years of marriage, unless someone gives them a very generous gift. So we struggle with the limited resources, but that's not such a big problem. We're in love, and there's the miracle of the new life. And so everybody is rejoicing about the new baby that has been born. Everybody is excited. So it's a very wonderful time in the life of a church, the birth of a church. Now, the second stage that I want to talk about is what I'm going to call the growth of the church. The growth of the church is still very young. It's just in the beginning stages, and so there's a lot of things that are similar to the first stage, but the members of the church are learning how to work together like a team. When they began, just like babies, they only think of themselves. But now they're learning how to work together to accomplish things that they could not accomplish on their own. They become very, let's call it solution-minded. Now they're focusing on different difficulties and problems they see, needs that their community has, and they are trying to help people. They're trying to find solutions to these problems. Of course, at this age, there's very high creativity. It's just like you very seldom see a little child that is bored. Why? Because they can make a game out of anything. And so because of their creativity and their new relationship with God, they have a lot of faith. They don't have a lot of money usually, but they've got a lot of faith to believe God for great things. And so they're working together. It's an exciting time of life. There is a great emphasis at this stage on tolerance and unity. Now, that's very, very key, because you'll find that they lose that later in their growth cycle. But at this stage, they're happy with each other, and they're working together in tolerance and unity. They like each other, and there's a sweet harmony. It's always a wonderful place to be in a church where people actually like each other, because you go to some churches and it's like everybody comes out and they're not happy. And so those are not exciting places. But at this stage in the life of the church, it's a very exciting stage. They also begin to develop their value system. Now, I want to slow down here for just a moment and point out that the word values comes from something that means it has value. It's the reason we count our money, is because our money has value. We place value upon it, so we count our money. Well, the same is true for the church at this stage. They begin to discover the things that are important to them, important to God, important for their future. And so their value system is being developed in this stage of the church. The growth of a church. It's springtime, and they're growing and learning together. Now, let me take you to the third stage of the church. This third stage of the church is what I'm going to call the maturity of the church. The maturity of the church. And if we were looking at it at a human being, the new birth, of course, is the baby that's just been born, and it's growing in its infancy. Then the second stage, is the growth of a church, would be the stage where they're growing from being a little child into their youth. But when we come to the maturity of the church, we're now what we would call young adults. Young adults, the maturity of a church. They've come to adulthood. They're now a mature individual. Notice what happens. As the church matures, the structure for ministry remains simple and focused on the future. Now, if I'm using the illustration of the human body, we would say their bones are still very, very alive. They're not fragile. They're not easy to break. They're very strong. But they're keeping things simple. Things haven't become very complex yet. It's not complicated. As you go through life, you're going to discover that, because growing up as a young man, first of all, I was just a boy. I was single. Then I got married, and then there were two of us. And then not only the two of you, but soon there's the babies. And then after a while, after a few years, you don't have the babies, but you have the grandchildren that are born. And then you have to factor in not only your family, but also her family. And so life becomes very complicated and complex. The same is true with a church. But at this stage in the maturity of a church, it's still fairly simple. You have good structure. You have good values. So at this stage, they continue to be flexible and changeable. You're going to discover as you go through life that change becomes more difficult. It becomes harder for you to change as you age. But at this stage in the church's life, they're flexible and changeable, and they change things more easily than an older church would do. They don't have a lot of traditions. They're just establishing their traditions. They're making those traditions at this point. Their ministry, the ministry of a church at this stage is still very innovative. They're very creative in the way they do things. Now, of course, this makes them much more adaptable to their communities. They can communicate to the people that are around them much more easily at this stage than an older church is able to do. So their ministry is very creative. Another thing I would say about their ministry is it's very evangelistic or outward focused. Not inward focused, they're outward focused. They're thinking about all the people that are around them. How can we influence this community? How can we reach the people that are around us with the good news of Jesus Christ? How can we share what God has done in our life with other people like us? And so their ministry is very evangelistic. That's the way they think. They're thinking in an outward way. The members of the church at this stage are still willing to sacrifice to see the church continue to grow. Now we're going to see in just a few moments that that's not true in all churches, and tragically so. But when you come to this stage of maturity, now you're not a baby anymore. You're not even young anymore. You've come into maturity. You know who you are. You know the gifts that God has given you, and you know how to utilize them. That's what we're talking about with the maturity of the church. It's an excellent time in the life cycle of any church. But things change. And it brings us to my fourth point. The fourth point I want to talk about is what I call the maintenance of a church. The maintenance of a church. Now, tragically, this happens in the life cycle of almost every church. You reach this stage, you're not just mature anymore, but suddenly you have seen a gradual shift that's happened to you. You didn't even realize it when it was taking place. The focus, the emphasis of the church has changed from the future to the past. Now you start talking a lot about the good old days. Or do you remember back? And we keep referring to the past. Be very careful, because now you've entered into, let me call it, the danger zone. The danger zone. I have said for many, many years that churches don't die. Somebody kills them with bad decisions, with bad choices. Well, it's not intentional. No, it's not they're trying to commit spiritual suicide. No, but because of the process, the aging process, you have now changed your focus from outward to inward, from the future to the past. And when you do that, you have now entered into what I'm going to call the maintenance of the church. What do I mean by that? I mean they have become mechanical in their approach to ministry. This is the danger in every one of our lives spiritually. For preachers, for teachers, if we're not careful, you start relying on the past, what you already know, and you stop learning. You stop looking ahead. You stop growing in your relationship with God, and now suddenly you take the attitude, know what to do now. I know how to teach. I know how to preach. And we stop relying on God. We start relying on ourselves, on our past experiences, what we already know. That's the danger spot. Because when you reach that spot, suddenly the life starts going out in your life. You lose that sparkle in your eyes. You lose the excitement, the enjoyment. As I said, of a child can make a game of anything. But if we're not careful as we age, we can kill anything with a bad attitude, bad ideas. We're not happy, and we don't want anybody else to be happy around us. Stop singing, because that's noise to us. Do you see what's happened? The emphasis has changed here. And we've gone from an evangelistic thrust of reaching out to others to an inward focus. At this point, it's become my church or our church. Us four and no more. That kind of attitude, it will kill any church. And yet, every one of us, if we visited as many as 3 churches, I can assure you, you've been in at least one that was spiritually dead. Another thing that happens is, I mentioned the bone structure. When you're young, your bones are growing along with your body. But when you reach maturity, your bones stop growing. The same thing happens in church structure. Church structure at this stage becomes very heavy and unyielding. Everything becomes rules that we live by. And if we're not careful, we're going to kill the church. We're going to destroy the very gift that God has given to us. And when you reach this stage of maintenance, the value system changes for you. The members now begin to place a high value on tradition. Oh, when you're young, you don't have any traditions. You look at a newly married couple, they don't have traditions. The new baby, I mean, everything's exciting, it's new, but now you've been there before. As we say, you were there, you got the t-shirt to prove it. And that's what happens to too many churches. And they reach this place where tradition becomes the most important thing. They don't want anything to change. Don't mess up our church. We got it the way we want it. We like it this way. We don't want anything to change. Now, what they don't realize is things are changing. They are aging. And if they're not careful, their church will die with them. See, what they've done, they've changed their focus in life. Their focus has shifted from reaching new people to keeping who we have, keeping them happy. Of course, the truth of it is you can't keep anybody happy. Happiness is a choice of the heart. You are happy because you choose to be happy, or you are unhappy because you choose to be unhappy. The choice is yours. But they've changed their focus, and now the church has become about them and keeping their members happy. And you look around and you realize there's nobody happy in this church. And so it brings me to my 5th stage. The 5th stage that I want to talk about is what I call the death of a church. The death of a church. It's tragic, and yet there are millions of churches like this. The life has gone out of their spiritual services. You do not sense the presence of God in their house anymore. You go to their church, but it's like God doesn't go there. There are no new births that are taking place. Now, please listen to me at this point, because there's so many churches like this. And grandmas and grandpas don't have new babies. That's not the way it works. And so there are no new births that are taking place. There is very little enthusiasm. They're not excited about their relationship with God. They're not happy with life. They're not happy with themselves. They're not happy with God. So there's little enthusiasm. And there becomes a very low tolerance for difference of opinion. In other words, they become very critical and complaining. Oh, God help us. How many churches are stuck in this cycle? It's the death of the church, and they're just simply waiting until the last one dies so they can close the door. Another thing that happens, the members begin to quarrel quite frequently. They get into a lot of church squabbles. Everybody's unhappy and trying to get their way. And of course, what takes place is people start leaving the church. The few people that they have that are not happy, until you just got a few of those that control everything. And as I said, churches don't die. Somebody kills them with bad decisions. Now, the question that I would ask you, the one I think is most important, is what can be done to stop this death cycle? God is not the God of the dead. God is the God of the living. So if God is the God of the living, and Jesus said that, Jesus pointed that out to some very unhappy Pharisees and Sadducees, these Jewish zealots that were so upset and frustrated and angry that they killed their own Messiah. I mean, he spoke to them and he said, God is not the God of the dead. God is the God of the living. And that's what I say to you today. So what can be done that will stop this? We've got to change the way that we think. We're making bad decisions based on bad ideas. Here's what we must do. We must intentionally start thinking generationally. We've got to start thinking about a younger generation, about those that have never lived their lives, those that are just beginning their life. And what we need to do is to start bringing them into church leadership. Now, the truth is, Grandpa will never be the grandson again. At one time, I was a grandson, and it was a nice place to be. I still remember my grandparents with fond memories, but they've been gone for many years now. I'm not a grandson anymore. I've become Grandpa. Or it's as one wise man said, I cannot be your future because I am your past. Boy, that is the truth. That is the truth. So you've got to change the way that you think. And it's what I'm going to call the rebirth of a church. The rebirth of a church. The church doesn't have to die, but if we're going to keep the church from dying, we've got to find a way we can do a rebirth process. Here's the way that takes place. Stop pulling weeds and start planting seed. Boy, that's good counsel. Stop looking for the things that are wrong. Start looking for some things that are right and start planting seed rather than pulling weeds. I remember talking to a man that was taking care of the lawns, the grass, the greens, they call them, on the golf courses. And we asked him, what is the secret of keeping this spot so green? And he said, we never go around pulling up any weeds, because every time you pull up a weed, you leave a hole, and that leaves a place for another weed to grow. He said, all we do is keep putting out more and more seed until it becomes like a carpet of grass. That's what we need to do in the church. Something else we need to do is start intentionally. Now notice my word here. It's not going to happen accidentally. It's something you must decide to do as a leader. Intentionally bringing young people to the table. Bringing them in, putting them in leadership positions. Helping them, training them, mentoring them for future leadership. Now, something I would caution you here is these young people that you bring into your leadership circle, they need to have our DNA in them. In other words, they haven't had time to establish their own values. They haven't had time to have their own experiences to produce wisdom of what works and what doesn't work. So they need to have our DNA and respect us as leaders, as the spiritual fathers and mothers that we are. Now, if we do this, we do it properly. If we promote them into ministry, they will help the church to go through a new growth cycle, a rebirthing cycle. That's God's plan. That is God's intent for our lives. Now, I caution you again, be careful. If you bring people in with a different DNA, you cannot remove the DNA out of a church without killing it. It's just like my body. I can't take the DNA out of me without killing me, because that's who I am. What we have to do is mix the DNA of a new generation. See, we can't take it out without killing it, but we can splice this new DNA of a new generation into the DNA of the church. And it causes the church to start a rebirthing cycle. So the graph would look similar to this. Rather than the one that ends in death, you would go from birth to growth to maturity into maintenance and then rebirth. Rather than dying and declining, you go into rebirth because of the wise decisions that you have made. This is God's plan for the positive way to change a church. It's the way God is intended, just like families continue to grow. The Bible tells us in the book of Proverbs, the 17th chapter and verse 6, children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children is their father. That's God's plan also for the church. And so may God help us to experience a rebirth of the church rather than the death of the church. May God bless you as we continue to follow Christ in our journey of faith.